So I have Dr. Aaron Pomerantz with me today on the Dave Elswick Show, and he's a psychologist, and we're going to talk to him about this anti-Semitism. Doc, I got to tell you, a lot of people look at what's going on now, and they're wondering, where does anti-Semitism come from? I got to tell you, evidently it's been there for a long time, has it not?
Yeah, it's called the world's oldest hatred for a reason. And I think that a lot of people who are discussing where is this coming from, and then they're acting very surprised. I think those of us who've experienced it in the past aren't as shocked as the rest of the world seems to be.
But it is kind of bizarre and amazing to me that you look at a country like the United States, and you have a group of terrorists that come across the border from Gaza and murder 1,500 innocent people. I mean, we're talking civilians here, just mow them down, cut off their heads with shovels, light them on fire, torture them, do all kinds of despicable things. And somehow these people look for moral equivalency with Hamas. I mean, there's something going wrong in somebody's head when they do that, I would think.
I think if they were actually trying to draw more, if they were going to actually admit, oh, this all happened, and they repeated what you just said, that all these things were done, and that they understood what the actual situation was, and they drew that equivalency, then yes, there might be something wrong with them. But I think what's actually going is a lot more complicated than that, and in some ways a lot more scary than that. I think what's driving this, and I talk about it in my piece, is what I'm calling toxic empathy. Like the sympathy with Hamas. Now, obviously, there are some actual hardcore ideological anti-Semites involved in this. People like Linda Sarsour or Rashida Tlaib. There's real anti-Semitism on right wing and left wing. That's always been true. But I think with the recent sympathizing with Hamas and the pro-Palestinian cause is driven by empathy. It's not driven by hatred. It's driven by empathy with the Palestinians. The problem is that it's not driven by a real form of empathy, because empathy is good. Empathy is important. Without empathy, we don't have a functioning society. But to have empathy, understanding and feeling other people's emotions, you have to have the capability to understand who the people you're feeling empathy for are. And I think there's been a lot of conflation of the Palestinian people, who do have a very difficult situation to navigate and who have faced a great deal of oppression, most of it from Hamas. Mm-hmm. There's a conflation of those people with the Hamas cause. And there's this filling in the blanks that people are doing mentally. They see words used in the Hamas charter, which has been intentionally created to appeal to progressive values. They see words like colonialism. They see words like apartheid being misused, and admittedly misused just for the emotional effect. And they go, oh, I understand exactly what's going on. I understand who these people are. I can feel as they feel. I can know as they know. I can see as they see. But for the vast and overwhelming majority of these people, they've never been to Israel. They've never been to Gaza. They've never been to the West Bank. They're not Israeli. They're not Jewish. They're not Arabic. They have no idea about what's actually going on, what these people believe. And you see this in a lot of the language being used. The Palestinian liberation is a women's choice, a women's bodily autonomy cause. It's an LGBTQIA cause. It's a, fill in the blank cause, because they're not really feeling empathy or connection with the Palestinians or even with Hamas. They've created this mental image of what all that is in their heads that's really just led them to insert themselves into the situation. And if they're feeling empathy for anyone, it's this fictionalized, projected version of themselves with darker skin and a keffiyeh, as opposed to any of the actual, Palestinian people who deserve their sympathy and empathy, or the Israelis who deserve their sympathy and empathy, Israeli Jews or Israeli Arabs who are victims of Hamas.
Right.
So it's not. I don't think many people are going to sit there and actually say, "Oh yeah, I'm happy Hamas committed this butchery." And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of people claim it was a false flag operation by Israel. It was, it's being overblown, or saying things like, well, Israel's doing bad stuff too, and misrepresenting what Israel's doing to try to draw that equivalence. Because no one wants, I don't think anyone or very few people are going to actually support what Hamas did. What we're seeing is cognitive dissonance, or rather trying to avoid cognitive dissonance by justifying it so they can keep empathizing with the perceived victims of injustice.
I read an article.
Ironically,
go ahead.
Yeah, not do that. Sorry, ironically, again, while they're not actually empathizing with the actual victims of injustice on either side, because this is all fictional in their heads.
Yeah, they're delusional is what it comes down to. I mean, they believe a delusion that they've created in their own head.
Yeah, I mean, they've constructed a reality based on what they see online and what they want to believe and what they've motivated themselves to believe that leads them to these behaviors and these attitudes.
Let me ask this question. I read an article a couple of weeks ago by Ben Shapiro. I'm sure you're familiar with Ben, and you may even know Ben. I've been friends with him for years. And he made the statement that the biggest problem that we have in the West dealing with what's going on with Hamas and other groups of their ilk is that we think they think the way we think, and they do not think the way we think. They got a whole different type of thought process going, and a lot of people can't get their hands around that.
I think that's correct. There are so many cultural and historical differences and dynamics going on in this situation that most people in the West just can't fathom. For starters, I think a lot of people assume that because they've watched Fiddler on the Roof and were dragged to a Holocaust museum in 4th grade, they understand what it is to be Jewish and they understand Jewish pain.
Mm-hmm.
They don't.
Right.
They don't understand. They don't understand how that actually works. They don't understand how the Holocaust actually happened. Within 2 years, the American public was already deluding itself that the Holocaust couldn't have happened here and that there was something different about Americans as opposed to the Germans. That's literally why my discipline of psychology, social psychology, came into being. It was a lot of Jewish psychologists going, no, there's nothing genetic about Germans that made this happen there.
Let me stop you right there. I brought this point up last week, and I said a lot of people who sit down and watch the History Channel or watch Nat Geo or whatever, and we watch those documentaries about World War II and about the Nazis, and then they always have the special one that's about the Holocaust, and that's either an hour or 2 hours, and you watch that and you think to yourself, somewhere along there you're going to think to yourself, how did a whole nation buy into this? And then I look at all of the protests that are going around in America today, and I go, maybe I'm seeing a little bit of that, what happened in Germany, happening right here in my own country right now.
One of the most powerful experiences of my life was going to Dachau, just outside of Munich in Germany. And in the first room of the concentration camp is a map, but the second room and the third room go over the political situation in Germany. And the signs are in English and German. And I think that anyone, right-wing or left-wing, no one can go into that room and read it and not feel at least a little bit conflicted and a little bit uncomfortable, I think, if they're being honest with themselves. So I think that's one thing people are misunderstanding, is they're not understanding their own actions. They're not understanding the history of anti-Semitism. They just assume that, oh, well, I'm not being like a Nazi, or I'm not being like a Soviet, or I'm not being like this when I act this way, because they don't realize that anti-Semitism isn't something, out of a sci-fi movie. It's not somebody sitting there being villainous. I think the second misunderstanding culturally that's going on, this is probably more directly what's going on with what Ben Shapiro was talking about, is in the West, especially in the Northwest and the West Coast of America, we're what's called a dignity culture. The Middle East is an honor culture.
That's right.
Entirely on it's based on reciprocity. It's based on reputation, and it's a no holds barred kind of culture when it comes to something like conflict. And if you try to, and we know this from over 30 years of cultural psychology examining these questions, honor dynamics are harmful in a dignity environment, and dignity norms don't work in an honor environment. There's just some cultural miscommunication going on here. There's a version of culture of honor here in the United States, that's true, but it's far milder than what you see in the Middle East. So when you see people saying things like they call it the big calls for a ceasefire, well, Hamas already broke a ceasefire. They broke a ceasefire on October 7th. There was a ceasefire there. And it's like, okay, Hamas can promise that, this time they mean it. In terms of an honor culture, they have no problem breaking their word if it's made with Israel or with the West. Yeah. Same for Iran, same for Hezbollah, because they don't believe that Jews are their equals, and they believe that Israeli Arabs are worse. That Israeli Arabs are traitors, and the existence of Israeli Jews on what they see as their land is an insult. They can't tolerate that insult, and there is going to be no holds barred, no limits on what they are willing to do to get stuff back. I think that's why you saw so much sexual violence in the October 7th attack. There's an old Arabic proverb, a man's honor lies between the legs of a woman. There's a reason that sexual violence was so prominent and is so prominent when Hamas does these things. This is designed to humiliate and utterly try to break Israelis. And that's why the Israeli government, and I want to say point blank, I'm no fan of Netanyahu, and I'm even less of a fan of Ben-Gvir. And ironically, neither is the rest of Israel. They're like the most unpopular government in Israeli history. But on the other hand, the idea that Israel can somehow afford, and Israel's government can somehow afford to start trusting Hamas, or that, if they were just nicer to Hamas, this wouldn't happen, that's nonsense.
I got you.
There's a fundamental cultural misunderstanding here, because people in the West would go, oh, well, if I were being pummeled like this, if I were in Hamas's situation, I'd want a ceasefire and I'd be willing to talk. And you would, most likely, because you have been in some way touched by the dignity norms that the post-Enlightenment culture of the United States tends to at least be somewhat influenced by. But in terms of how somebody who supports Hamas is thinking, no. They want a ceasefire so they can get a chance to dig another tunnel. They do not think as we think.
All right.
And yeah.
Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about that a little bit more, what you're talking about, because the leader of Hamas had that interview on Lebanese television, and he said something that really startled me. Shouldn't have, but it did. And I want to bring it up with you, but we got to get a break in and pay some bills, and then Doc will be back with you in a second. Dr. Aaron Pomerantz is our guest, and we're going to continue talking with him when we return. Why the rise in anti-Semitism and this whole idea of misplaced empathy and not understanding cultures and stuff all plays into it, and we'll get back into it when we return. All right, we got about 5 minutes left with Dr. Aaron Pomerantz. And we want to talk further with him about his article that he had out earlier this week, as well as I saw the interview that the leader of Hamas did on Lebanese television. And one of the things that he said really stuck with me, Doc. And, you always hear the people on Hamas talking about the occupation of Gaza. Well, there hasn't been an Israeli soldier in Gaza since 2007 when Hamas took over. However, he said that there is an occupation as long as there is one Jew in any Arab land. That just kind of stunned me that they believed it. I don't know why it stunned me, but it did. That is what they believe, and that's why in their charter for Hamas that they wrote up back in 1988 calls for the complete annihilation of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not shocked. I'm just not. There's been this narrative, and it's insidious. It's just wild to me that somehow we were liked in the Middle East before 1948. There's this myth, and I'll say there's some truth to the fact that, yes, compared to the Holy Roman Empire and a lot of Western Europe and Eastern Europe, the Ottoman Empire specifically was nicer for Jews than the Christian world, because if you were going to be a second-class citizen, you may as well be one in the Ottoman Empire. They had better legal protection for you. That much is true. The Ottoman Empire also did hold a lot of the Arab colonials in line in earlier history. Maimonides was Saladin's personal physician. There has been a history of certain positive Jewish-Muslim relations. I will never deny that. That being said, very specifically in the land of Israel, pogrom after pogrom after pogrom after pogrom. You can trace these things. The idea that they welcomed Jews with open arms after the Holocaust is just absolutely insane. There were tons of pogroms in Algeria, attacks on Jews in Libya and Iraq.
Well, we know about Russia. Russia, was one after another.
Well, that's specifically Russia, but remember, those aren't Arabs.
Oh yeah, I understand that.
Just specifically, I'm saying even just specifically Arabs in the Middle Eastern world. So like they've never liked Jews. They wanted Jews. They were happy to have Jews, perhaps as second-class citizens, but the Jews were always violently opposed, and the Mufti of Jerusalem met with Adolf Hitler, and was really interested in bringing the Holocaust to what was then the Mandate of Palestine. This goes back to that cultural idea. Jews were allowed as long as they were a second-class citizen, but for us to stand up and say, actually, this is our homeland, we're taking it back. It's been 2,000 years and you haven't done much with the place. We'd like it, but we're taking it back now. That's an insult. So of course Hamas wants every single Jew wiped off the land, because it's an insult. And in a culture of honor, you cannot tolerate an insult. So when people in the West say, oh, like everything got on, they're just responding to Jewish and Western aggression, it's like, that's historically ignorant. You're being empathetic for something that doesn't exist, and from our culture you'd have no possible understanding of.
Doc, I've run out of time. Thanks so much for being with us. Where can people get a copy of that article?
You can find that particular article on Real Clear World.
All right. Appreciate you. Thank you so much.